Good evening. Today is June 22nd, 2017. We're with Shodai, founder and director of the Institute for Biopsychocultural Studies, reviewing one of his latest essays called the Biopsychocultural Theory Manifesto. Students of the Institute have compiled a series of questions for him to elaborate on. And just for the record, Shodai hasn't seen or heard any of these questions. And we would like to start with our first question. How does biopsychocultural theory manages to identify the internal signs of a culture's social, economic, and political decay?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Lourdes, for the introduction, and thank all the students who contributed to the questions for me. Now, how does biopsychocultural theory manage to identify the intrinsic signs of decay of a given culture? Is that the question?
Yes, the internal signs of a culture's social, economic, and political decay.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, we can look at the culture or a nation or a community belonging to that culture, look at them statistically, and see if over a period of time certain statistics, if we're looking at a nation, we can look at GDP per capita. If we're looking at a community, we can look at salaries or average household income per year. So there's some clear statistical indicators that we can look at, we can examine and see if over time that particular community or nation corresponding to that culture has been going downhill. Okay, that's one way of looking at it, and it's actually a very good way because, at least to start off with, because it gives us some objective data. People tend to not want to recognize that they're in trouble. They tend to not want to recognize that, particularly, that they have in some way contributed to the cause of their own decline. So we like to look at objective statistics, objective data that make it more difficult for a community or a nation belonging to a particular culture to simply reject offhand. So that's one way. First of all, we start off with some statistics, then we look at, we try to find correlations. Try to find correlations that explain why certain cultures are in decline compared to other cultures, because being in decline is a relative concept. You're in decline with respect to something else or someone else that is on the rise, or at least is maintaining itself. So we need to establish a comparison to show, well, they're down here in this particular dimension, and this other group is up here on that same dimension, and we need to be able to represent that also numerically in an objective fashion. In biopsychocultural theory, we identified a combination of three dimensions of a given culture: social well-being, political stability, and economic prosperity, and we call that a triad. And the acronym for that is SPET. The social well-being, political stability, economic prosperity triad, SPET for short. So we try to look at different manifestations of a community or a nation's SPET with respect to belonging to a particular culture, and compare it to another one, to another culture's SPET, and see if they are in decline, if one's rising, the other one's falling, and then try to identify specific factors upon which we can make this comparison.
Talking about that SPET concept, there's another question about why.
That'd be question number 2.
Question number 2.
Okay.
Why?
Well, first of all,
yes.
Was my answer to question number 1 satisfactory?
Yes.
Okay, so that's important.
Thank you.
Number 2.
Number 2. You also state that there's extrinsic and intrinsic factors. Talking about the SPED of a nation. And the question would be, which is more important for the SPED, the intrinsic factor or extrinsic factor?
Okay. First, let me explain for the audience what I mean by extrinsic versus intrinsic factors. Extrinsic factors are those that come from outside that community, that nation, outside that culture, and they're affecting its SPED. For example, we can take African Americans. Now, there is no doubt that racism has played a major role in maintaining or making it far more difficult for African Americans to rise above. I don't mean individually, okay? I'm speaking of as a community as a whole. They've made it very much more difficult than other ethnicities or other cultures, other groups to rise above their situation, especially coming after slavery. There was never really an environment that would facilitate the integration, the social and economic and political integration of African Americans into the United States economy, society, politics at large. This, of course, despite the fact that we just had an African American president, but that's one individual. If you look at the statistics per se, African Americans are at the bottom of the barrel in many different dimensions. In terms of, for example, teenage pregnancies, in terms of poor academic performance, in terms of household income, etc., etc. Not to mention incarceration rates. Now, it's well established that American society, American culture at large, is inhospitable, to say the least, to African Americans. Now, those would be extrinsic factors. We can think of racism in all its dimensions. Okay? However, there are also intrinsic factors. And those are the ones that are from within, that have to do with the culture itself. Now, here's a tricky situation. Here's what's so difficult about this. A culture is formed in adaptation to an environment. In a type of it's an adaptation that transcends physiology. Has to do with mindsets, has to do with behaviors, etc., including religion, religious values and rituals, etc. Okay, in adaptation to a particular environment. So one can argue quite readily that African American culture adapted itself to the hostile conditions that from which it arose. And after all, they're African Americans. They came in as slaves, and they had to adapt to that condition for centuries. And then, well, after slavery was abolished, they weren't exactly welcomed and integrated into society. Okay, so they adapted as best as they could, psychologically and in other many ways, to those conditions. Now, here's the problem. Those same adaptations become intrinsic factors that make it more difficult for them to transcend, to make the most out of the opportunities that exist for them in society, in a hostile environment. I'm not denying it. It's a hostile environment. Extrinsic factors are hostile, but the intrinsic factors have a tendency to maintain African American culture where it is, at the bottom of the barrel. Okay, what are some of those intrinsic factors? Well, high religiosity. It is the culture with the highest religiosity in the United States. And high religiosity, as I demonstrated in my book, Broken Arrow, The End of Western Liberal Democracy, why America is imploding, and why Europe will follow. Okay? It correlates with what? It correlates with low income and low education. Now you could say, well, correlation is not causation. You could say that, well, the low education and the low income leads people to high religiosity. Okay, well, it's an argument that I address in the book. But the bottom line is this. Okay, the bottom line is this. You can increase someone's income, like say they become athletes, professional athletes, or singers. But the question is, does that change their religiosity? No, it does not. So, what does this mean? It means that their high religiosity is one of those intrinsic factors that's keeping them where they are. Why the high religiosity? Well, if you read any of the accounts, first-hand accounts of what it was like to be a slave, or just from the beginning, from the passage over, you would realize that it would be very useful for someone, for a group of people, a community of people, to have that kind of escape from material reality in order to survive psychologically. The problem is that it no longer benefits them. So while for a period of time that high religiosity had a psychological, social benefit for African Americans, nowadays when there are other opportunities available to many, it's no longer an asset, it's a liability. So which is more important, intrinsic or extrinsic factors? Well, it depends. Okay? If you're a member of a culture, if you're a cultural community, you cannot change the extrinsic factors. They're beyond you by definition. I mean, if you could elevate the whole community's economic position, political position, then you could. But in order to do that, you would have to change the intrinsic factors first. So, intrinsic factors are more important from the standpoint of a given culture, because after all, those are things you can control. You might not want to. I mean, people are just, generally speaking, not about to admit that, hey, my religion, my beliefs, the time I spend in Bible study is not good for my community. We'd be better off at the library studying something else, philosophy, chemistry, physics, mathematics, etc. Okay, changing our worldview. Okay, they're not about to admit that. But theoretically, at least, they control it. Theoretically, that's under their control. And there have been also other ethnic communities, other cultures that have been, I won't say as equally ostracized as African Americans, but quite so. They're not exactly beloved by society at large. And because their intrinsic factors are different, they have been extremely successful. I talk about this in the book. Okay.
Thank you, Master Shah.